Good evening and welcome. I am Michael Kessler, Assistant Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, where I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Government. On behalf of the Berkley Center, I would like to welcome you to this evening's program, a discussion and debate of E.J. Dionne's new and important book, Sold Out: Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right. The Berkley Center's work explores the intersection of religion and politics in international and comparative perspective. That global view also encompasses how faith and politics intersect in the United States, arguably the most powerful country in the world, and a country where religion and politics have always been intertwined in both domestic affairs and foreign policy. Among our main projects is a program on religion and U.S. politics in global perspective, which examines both perceptions and realities of religion and public affairs in the U.S. Activities include a website, faith2008.org, which tracks religious rhetoric in the current campaign. We also collaborate with the Washington Post's On Faith website, which features a blog by our colleague Jacques Berliner-Blau entitled The God Vote. Tonight's program, in collaboration with the Georgetown Public Policy Institute, is one in a series of events on religion in the 2008 election, which will feature prominent politicians, journalists, and religious leaders discussing religion's role in the politics of the 2008 election. I am delighted that my colleague and friend, E.J. Dionne, is able to join us this evening as a featured part of this program. Another event in the series, a conversation between Senator Sam Brownback and President DeGioia, will take place next week on Wednesday. Also, stay tuned for details about other exciting events in the works. It is now my pleasure to welcome President John J. DeGioia, who will introduce both of our speakers. Dr. DeGioia has served as president of Georgetown University since 2001. He earned both his Bachelor of Arts degree in English and his PhD in philosophy from Georgetown. President DeGioia is a global representative of Georgetown. He is a member of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and chair of its Education Committee. He is on the board of directors of Project Rebirth, which is documenting the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site. And he represents Georgetown at the World Economic Forum and on the Council of Foreign Relations. As president, he also makes time to teach undergraduates in the Department of Philosophy on topics ranging from the practice of leadership to ethics and global development. Finally, and important to our discussion this evening, President DeGioia has been a visionary leader in creating institutional spaces of reflection and dialogue about the most pressing issues we face. Institutional spaces like the Berkley Center, where academic, government, and religious leaders can gather to analyze and debate religion's role in affairs around the globe. Through his time and effort in building these academic centers, Georgetown students and faculty and community members have the unique opportunity to engage thought leaders from around the world, to advance the interdisciplinary study of religion through research and teaching, to promote interreligious understanding, and to bring this reflection to bear creatively upon pressing real-world problems. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Jack DeGioia.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction and for all of your efforts to make this evening a reality. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening to hear reflections from a valued member of the Georgetown University community, E.J. Dionne, on his most recent book, Sold Out: Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right, and to participate in a discussion this evening with E.J. and with another acclaimed journalist, Ray Suarez, on politics and faith. This is a wonderful opportunity to explore together the role that religion should play in our common life together. The deepest conviction that we have as a university is that religion is a source for good, a source for truth, a source for justice. We're also aware that religion has been used and continues to be used as a justification for actions that are evil, a source contrary to the truth, a source for injustice. And E.J. Dionne we have a member of our faculty who goes to the heart of this challenge and questions those that say religion does not have anything of real value to say about social justice, peace, or providing for the neediest and most marginalized in our midst. In this new book, he outlines how the American political landscape is undergoing seismic changes, how the role of value issues and the value of religion is changing. Conservatives are rethinking the public implications of their faith, such as engaging with the suffering in Africa, as evangelical Rick Warren, who spoke here just last month, actively urges. And liberals are remembering that many of their social justice goals have biblical, religious, and spiritual roots. These two ideas from both sides of the political spectrum certainly resonate here at Georgetown, where we strive to always remember, in the words of former Jesuit Superior General Pedro Rupe, that love of God which does not issue injustice for all is a farce. As I noted earlier, Georgetown is proud to have such a remarkable individual, or a renowned author, columnist, and political analyst as a member of our faculty. As many of you are aware, since 2003, EJ has served as university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture here at Georgetown. But his career has been long and distinguished. He spent 14 years with the New York Times, where his coverage of the Vatican was described as, quote, the best in 2 decades, close quote, by the Los Angeles Times. In 1990, he joined the Washington Post, and 3 years later, he began his popular op-ed column that is now syndicated in more than 90 papers. He is also a regular political analyst on National Public Radio, a respected political commentator on various television and radio broadcasts, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Including Sold Out, EJ has written 4 books on politics and political trends. His first book, the best-selling Why Americans Hate Politics, was a National Book Award nominee and the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. We're also grateful this evening to have with us another distinguished journalist and author who will add his voice to our discussion, to our conversation this evening. Ray Suarez has over 30 years of experience in the news business. In 1999, he joined the NewsHour as a Washington-based senior correspondent. Before that, he hosted Talk of the Nation on National Public Radio, and previously he covered local, national, and international stories for the NBC station in Chicago, WMAQ. He's also worked as a Los Angeles correspondent for CNN, a producer for ABC Radio Network in New York, a reporter for CBS Radio in Rome, and for a variety of American and British news services in London. His most recent book, The Holy Vote, was published in 2006 and examines the tightening relations between religion and politics in America. He's also the author of The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Suburban Migration, and has contributed to several other books. He's twice won NPR's DuPont Columbia Silver Baton Award for outstanding on-site news coverage, and has been honored with the Ruben Salazar Award from the National Council of La Raza. We're truly privileged to have him join our conversation tonight. And now I'm going to turn it over to EJ to get us started, and then he'll be followed by some reflections by Ray, and then we're going to open it up to the whole audience. So EJ, it's a pleasure to have you tonight. Thank
you. Mr. President, I like the sound of President DeGioia. Thank you so much for those words. That was so much more generous than the introduction I received the other day when I was out of town talking about American politics, and the introduction ended. And now for the latest dope from Washington, here's EJ Dionne. And you should know that I stole that joke many years ago from Ray Suarez's distinguished colleague, Mark Shields, who is one of the funniest people who comments on politics. I want to thank Michael Kessler, who's done so much good work for the Berkley Center and has been struggling to teach me about Paul Tillich. I want to thank Ray, a thoughtful and courageous journalist. I know he's much smarter than I am because he went to the University of Chicago, and anybody who did, like David Brooks, like Ray Suarez, is much smarter than I am. And I wouldn't be here tonight without Jack DeGioia, and I just have an enormous debt to him. This book is very much rooted in Georgetown because at the heart of the book are 2 lectures I gave, one very early on before I got here, and my inaugural lecture, and I had what could have been a much longer acknowledgement of Jack in the book for making it possible for me to be here. But instead of going through a long list, because I write kind of epic acknowledgments in my book, my acknowledgments are so long that The Economist once attacked them. They didn't review the book, they just attacked my acknowledgments under the headline, "This is true, gratitude that grates." And so ever since they attacked me like that, my acknowledgments have gotten even longer. But what I did do is to thank Jack for encouraging me to re-engage the thinking of Pope John the 23rd. And he, as you know, Jack has made a project of having us all re-engage the thinking of John the 23rd. Jack really lives by what he says. You know, it's good to run into somebody who is a president who keeps his promises. And I just want to read two wonderful, that was not a political comment. I just want to read two wonderful passages from Jack's inaugural address. On October 13th, 2001, he said, "For Georgetown, the service of justice means engaging harsh realities head-on, knowing that the questions they raise about our priorities or our wealth as a country and as a community will sometimes make us uncomfortable. As a Catholic and Jesuit university, we heed the Church's call to powerfully engage the world, human culture, the environment, all ways of knowing. This creates a second set of questions and dynamic tensions that we relish here in the shared presence of the Academy and the Church. These are captured in the Catholic and, the relationship between faith and reason, nature and grace, reason and revelation, the natural and the supernatural. These are not idle abstractions for a university that seeks an integration between university and church, and I would just add that they are not idle abstractions for Jack DeGioia. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. Mine is one of the only books on religion, certainly one of the only books sympathetic to religion that actually begins with a joke. It is one of my favorite jokes. I've told it so often that many of my friends have sort of told me they got sick of hearing me tell this joke. And so I told them that if I put it at the beginning of the book, I would never tell the joke again. But the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. And I like the story anyway, and it fits for this book and this talk because it does remind us of how the words Jesus and religious were not always associated reflexively with the words right or conservative. It is the story of Mrs. O'Reilly and her son, who was dutifully taking her to the polls one election day. Mrs. O'Reilly always voted straight Democratic. Her son, a successful member of the upper middle class, had become an independent and actually voted for quite a few Republicans. As was their routine, the son asked the mother how would she vote, and as always, she answered straight Democratic. The exasperated son one day replied, "Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him." And she snapped back, "Oh, hush. Why should he change his party after all these years?" Now, a great many Americans have come to believe that he has indeed changed his party after all these years. And that, I think, is why, one of the central reasons why we have had such significant commotion around the issues related to religion and politics. On significant parts of the right and left, there is a sense that religion has always been and always will be a conservative force. There are Republican candidates and political operatives who assume that religious people live on the political right, care only about issues such as gay marriage and abortion, and will forever be part of the Republican political base. There are liberals, though fewer, I think, than conservatives think, and probably fewer today than there used to be since Democrats discovered God in the 2004 exit polls, who buy this Republican account and write off religious people as backward and reactionary busybodies obsessed with sex. On that exit poll lines, God can be discovered anywhere. Sold Out insists that religious faith does not lead ineluctably to conservative political convictions. It argues that the era of the religious right is over. Its collapse is part of a larger decline of a certain style of ideological conservatism that reached high points in 1980, 1994, perhaps in 2002, but suffered a series of decisive and, I believe, fatal setbacks during President Bush's second term. Now, the end of the religious right certainly does not mean a decline in evangelical Christianity or theological conservatism. On the contrary, if a Catholic may use this term, it is a sign of a new reformation among Christians who are disentangling a great religious movement from a political machine. This historic change will require liberals and conservatives alike to abandon their sometimes narrow views of who religious Americans are and what they believe. I was pleased that Jack mentioned Rick Warren, who plays an important part in my book. And Rick Warren is a fascinating figure because he is as conservative as they come on the social issues. But over the years, he has read his New Testament and Old Testament closely and realized that they are a call to care about the suffering and the needy. One of his missions, encouraged by his wife, has been a mission to the victims of AIDS in Africa. And about a year and a half ago, Rick Warren invited two senators to his church who had been very engaged in the problem of AIDS. One is coming here soon, Senator Sam Brownback. The other was a young senator named Barack Obama. When Rick Warren invited Barack Obama to his church, there was an outcry from religious conservatives who said, you cannot invite this liberal, you cannot invite this pro-choice senator. And Rick Warren wouldn't back down, and he gave an interview to ABC News in which he said, people ask me if I am right-wing or left-wing. Actually, I'm for the whole bird, he said. And I think what you're seeing in politics today is the rise of whole bird Christianity. In truth, religious people hold a wide array of political views. And religion is not the enemy of reason or science. People of faith are not blind automatons who never question their deepest beliefs. At the heart of my argument is the view that religious faith, far from being inevitably on the side of the status quo, should on principle hold this world to higher standards. Religious people should always be wary of the ways in which political power is wielded, skeptical of how economic privileges are distributed. They should also be wary of how their own traditions have been used for narrow political purposes and how some religious figures have manipulated faith to aggrandize their own power. The doctrine of original sin, the idea of a fallen side of human nature, these apply in principle to people who are religious no less than to those who are not. I still share Reinhold Niebuhr's view that original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church. Throughout history, our great religious traditions, and this is especially obvious in the Christian and Jewish scriptures with which I am most familiar, have preached a message of hope for more just and decent human arrangements. It really is hard to read the New Testament without thinking about the poor. My friend Jim Wallace likes to say that if you cut all of Jesus' references to the poor out of the New Testament, you end up with a book, you end up not with a book, but with a lot of holes. I once debated Ralph Reed when he was with the Christian Coalition, and I said, Ralph, I will always defend your right to base your political views on your religious beliefs, since mine have been very influential to me as well, and it would be hypocritical of me to do otherwise. But you must explain to me where in your New Testament you find that Jesus endorses a cut in the capital gains tax. I simply cannot find it in mine. The title of my book is intended to be read in two ways. It speaks to our country's exhaustion with a religious style in politics that was excessively dogmatic and ideological, a style reflecting a spirit far too certain of itself and far too insistent on the depravity of its political adversaries, linking religion too closely with the fortunes of any one political party, and I suppose Mrs. O'Reilly needed to remember this too, or to any leader or group of leaders is always a mistake. It encourages alienation from faith itself. Where, after all, did Voltaire come from? Where do the new atheist writers come from? By turning a concern for the ultimate into a prop for temporal power. The Americans, I believe, including a great many religious people, including a great many religious conservatives, have had enough of this use of religion. They have had enough for the reason embodied in the other sense of the title of my book,
reducing religion to politics or to a narrow set of public issues amounts to a great sellout of our traditions. It is common to speak of religion selling out to secularism or to modernity or to a fashionable relativism, but there is a more immediate danger, particularly here in the US, of religion selling out to political forces that use the votes of religious people for purposes having nothing to do with a religious agenda, and often for causes antithetical to their most basic beliefs. My book reflects an impatience with the very way in which values issues have been defined by pollsters. Remember that 2004 exit poll question where voters were asked, were they voting on Iraq, on the economy, on education, on poverty, or on moral values? Now, 22%, the largest number, said moral values. I always ask audiences if any of them cast their ballot in 2004 on the basis of immoral values. I have yet to find someone who said yes, but if I ever do, I want to invite them out for a drink after my talk. But look at that question another way. If you cared about economic justice, or if you were a libertarian who cared about government intrusion in economic life, if you cared about the Iraq War and had a moral objection to it, or thought we had a moral obligation to see it through, you were not defined as a moral voter, only if you checked that box that said moral values, which was presumed to refer only to a very small set of issues. The idea that the religious winds are changing is at the heart of the argument in Sold Out. I just want to make a couple of other points so that we can go to the discussion. I argue that the era of the religious right is over, and a lot of people question that, and it is indeed true that the religious right's obituary has been written many times, and perhaps appropriately, the religious right has had a significant capacity for resurrection. But I believe at this moment, the religious right has hit the end of the road, I would just sort of talk about sort of two basic pieces of evidence. The first I've already alluded to is this amazing change among religious conservatives themselves who are insisting on a broader definition of their movement and on what it means to be a Christian. This is especially visible among younger evangelical Christians. I also think you can see the same thing happening among Catholics, including among some of our more conservative Catholic brethren. But also, you can measure this in terms of political power, which, this being politics, is one legitimate measure. Consider the results of the 2008 Republican primary. The Republicans are the party in which the religious right was operating, and the two candidates left standing were the two candidates who were not supported by the religious right. The emergence of Mike Huckabee, in fact, put the fear of God into the Republican establishment. The Huckabee surge eventually abated, but his candidacy marked a break with what had been standard operating procedure within the Republican Party for a generation. Huckabee's evangelical army ignored the importuning of entrenched leaders of the religious right and decided to go with one of their own. Huckabee, as I see it, has 1 foot in the old religious right and 1 foot in the new disposition. It is worth recalling that he preached the gospel of evangelical populism, rejected conservative orthodoxy on trade, on the value of government, on the beneficence of Wall Street. He was no William Jennings Bryan. His national sales tax proposal was regressive and a little wacky, but Bryan would have appreciated Huckabee's attack on politics as a mere extension of economics. And then there was John McCain, who won the Republican nomination in the face of opposition from virtually the entire panoply of religious right leaders. Something very important is changing in our politics. I just want to conclude by suggesting that I think that liberals and conservatives still have something to learn from each other. I think that there is an obligation on the part of liberals to drop whatever prejudices they have against people of faith. I have a kind of friendly polemic with the new atheist writers in my book. On the one hand, I argue that the new atheists should be seen as providential because they are calling upon believers to do, as St. Paul said, to defend the faith that is within us. And also, atheists take the question of belief more seriously than almost anyone else. I once wrote a column taking off from Leon Wieseltier's wonderful piece in the Republic that ran under the headline, "God Bless Atheists." And Leon's point, again, was that atheists have a serious intellectual argument to make, and if believers cannot meet them on intellectual ground, they have to go back to the drawing boards. And I got my favorite email I ever got from a reader. You know, when you write a column, have your little name there. Somehow people tend to write you more when they disagree than when they agree. Original sin. Again, my favorite negative email that I can repeat here began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And so whatever else you get out of my talk tonight, you'll be able to answer that question before you leave. But this one came from an atheist who said, "Dear Mr. Dionne, I am an atheist, and if I may say so, God bless you." And I love that because it reflects a spirit of intellectual solidarity, a great phrase of the great Jesuit David Hollenbach, with which we should approach these questions. But I think, and we can talk about this later, that the problem with the neo-atheists is that they are at least as doctrinaire as the doctrinaire folks that they condemn. And they are, as my friend Corinne Davis, who's in the audience here somewhere, told me one day, they are an overreaction to an overreaction. But we can get into that. But I think at the same time, if liberals have an obligation to stand up for the rights of religious people in the public square, and also an obligation to recognize that religion has a legitimate role in public life, conservatives have an obligation as well. And that obligation is to avoid casting those who may disagree with them in their political views, not to cast such people into the depths of hell, not to insist that there is only one reading of the gospel, and yes, to recognize that our nation's, our First Amendment, our insistence upon religious liberty has strengthened rather than weakened religious communities in the United States. The Christian right, finally, is an abstraction. Millions of committed Christians who may have responded to the appeals of a political movement at a particular moment are rethinking not so much their politics as the public implications of their faith. Liberals, I believe, are changing too. Just listen to Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton on these subjects. They're remembering things they had forgotten about the spiritual sources of their own dreams. They're recalling that one of the great successes of the last half century, and we honor him tomorrow, for who was assassinated 60 years ago tomorrow, Martin Luther King. He was a Christian preacher who was inspired by our Declaration of Independence and the Scripture. One can simply not understand the civil rights movement apart from its inspiration from the Scriptures, and particularly from the book of Exodus. Liberals are, I think, realizing that bigotry against people of faith is still bigotry, and they are accepting that if religion can sometimes promote prejudice, it often promotes justice. They are coming to terms with the fact that their central goals to lift up the poor, feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, care for the sick, and challenge injustice have biblical roots and religious sanction. To end the religious and cultural wars and to allow religion to flower in public life, we need passion and we need humility. These are two virtues that do not always come together, but they must. We need a passion for moving our nation out of a period in which public problems went unsolved and the possibility of broad alliances were lost because political imperatives triumphed over the idea of the common good. And we need humility to understand how prejudices of believers against unbelievers and unbelievers against believers have obstructed our path and blurred our vision. We must recognize that self-righteousness is the enemy of righteousness, and I'm not picking a fight with St. Paul here, but I'm actually embracing a great recent encyclical by Pope Benedict. Hope is the virtue on which faith and love depend. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad my friend E.J. brought up the King assassination anniversary toward the end, because I think it's a reminder of how different a seminar on religion and politics might have been during the 1960s. we forget, because we are prisoners of the present to a degree that we are sometimes reluctant to admit, that the immediate post-war decades were marked, especially in Western religion, by an open alliance between center-left politics and political ideas and the power of religious movements. And you can look at the anti-war movement of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, look at Bill Coffin's Riverside Church, the pronouncements of the World Council of Churches. There was an idea that, chastened by the Second World War, that Christianity was a supranational movement and not a part of a way of understanding your own patriotism entwined with your religious feeling. And in a way, that post-war spirit also harkened back to the late 19th century when some of the great war horses of the English language hymnal were being written. In Christ there is no east or west, from Afric's sunny mountains to Greenland's icy strands. This idea that Christianity was a globe-girdling movement, and what you had in common with people in Greenland's icy mountains and Afric's sunny shores was that you were Christian, and your politics were quite beside the point. So we've come some distance from those post-war decades, and Jesus has changed his party, but only because we've flattened, cheapened, and sort of debased the coin of the realm when talking about something as vast and deep and a lifetime's vocation to understand as Christianity. I disagree with E.J. that the rise of the religious right is over. I think it's more taking a breath after scaling a sizable summit or engaging in one of those stunt stairway races in a skyscraper that they have in big cities. It may have passed its high water mark for the moment, and I agree with E.J. that the 7 years of the Bush presidency have really caused it to take that pause. It's really hard to exaggerate what a pivotal thing these 5 years have been in the enterprise of creating a permanent Republican majority and having Republican evangelical Christians be one of the midwives of that rise of a permanent majority. Any politician who goes to the public now and lays out his or her religion as a way of creating an unspoken link in the voter's mind between their religious convictions and their competence in office will pause and think again before doing that, because any time you have a publicly pious politician who toward the end of his time in office is at 30% approval, you have to pause before you want to make that presumed link or draw that presumed link for voters that there's some connection with a prayer life and being good at your job, because apparently we've learned that the voters don't think so. There is a reckoning coming in 2009 when the people who helped bring the 104th Congress to Washington, the people who helped make Tom DeLay majority leader, the people who helped make George W. Bush president in 2000, when the smoke clears in January 2009, like all those bumper stickers and backwards counting clocks remind us, all of the big agenda items that the institutional religious right got into harness with the Republican Party to accomplish will not have been accomplished, with the exception of the two new members of the Supreme Court, which is obviously a big exception, but abortion is still legal, religious schools still don't get government money, and you can go on and on and on. The administration has been in office long enough for us to find out that abstinence-only teaching is a total failure. And, you know, you can make a long list of the kind of things that people who got engaged got engaged to accomplish, and after they had everything going their way, the wind powerfully in their sails for much of the last 8 years, between a tightening grip over the courts, working majorities in the Senate and House, and the White House, still much of that agenda will not have been achieved, and they will, I predict, form what used to be called the Democratic firing squad, where you form a circle and let it rip, but soon will look like an evangelical firing squad. Rick Warren is part of a new generation of leaders of what will inevitably be a different kind of movement. But for every Rick Warren, there's a Rick Scarborough, who is the head of a megachurch in Texas, and every bit as ferocious in his intention of holding on to power and holding on to influence and trying to marshal the megachurch movement around the country toward political ends. He said, when Tom DeLay was forced to leave office, at a big tribute to him that was held in an arena with 18,000 people in it and no empty seats, that Tom DeLay was being forced from office not because of anything he had done wrong, but because he is a Christian. And there was a tremendous cheer that took the roof off of this place virtually. Those people have not disappeared. They have not been raptured up. They're not going anywhere. They are representative of a wide, I insist, what is still a wide conviction, widely held set of convictions in the United States about who has power, who has influence, what is bringing the country down, what's bad and what's good about America. When I interviewed Desmond Tutu in 1984, he got very angry at me when I started to talk to him about the social gospel. He rapped the top of the desk and said, "I do not preach the social gospel. I preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's what's driving them crazy and why they want to take my passport away." He he spoke of politics and religion in a way that made the good burghers who were running the government in Pretoria very uncomfortable, because they must have known that if there was a New Testament-style reckoning or a government that might be prescribed by the New Testament, it wouldn't look very much like what they were up to in South Africa. Are Americans more skeptical, more wary? Yes, but I will be interested to see if they're any less likely to be touched by religious appeals, to be vulnerable to religious persuasion when making their political choices. These are the same people who helped make that alliance happen, and they still believe the same things that they did, and they've also gotten a seat at the table, they've gotten a taste of power, they've gotten a taste of what it means to be able to pick up the phone, as one megachurch pastor bragged to me when I was sitting in his office, festooned with pictures of him and powerful office holders, to be able to pick up the phone and get somebody on the phone at the White House. This is heady stuff, and I doubt that he doesn't want to do it anymore. So what we've got to take more account of is the way religion has been used in our politics. Religious people, and in that broad rubric I count both myself and EJ, take that seriously. When somebody asks, well, what about politics and religion? What kind of relationship do they have? You tend to think of it, because you're serious about religion, as a serious question with serious implications. What would religion, rightly understood, have to say to the way we choose leaders and the way those leaders run our institutions? But in terms of the way we run campaigns and the way we use religion as a persuader, it has become more like fairy dust, a set of coded phrases meant to be sprinkled into speeches, references meant to serve as a wink to those members of the audience who get the reference and fly right over the head of millions of others who don't, like the quotes from Corinthians in the State of the Union address, like couplets from evangelical hymns that made it into Michael Gerson's and thus George Bush's mouth. Those religious allusions are meant to convey in an instantly consumable way messages about personal virtue that actually would take hours to talk about. But you just slide it in there and it has its effect. Saying, in effect, it's really identity politics. I'm like you, you're like me, we're comfortable with each other, and if I say there's wonder-working power in something, and don't say that it's the blood of the lamb, you know where that phrase wonder-working power comes from. Nuff said, I've completed my wink, let's move on. It rarely has to do with something really hard. Susan B. Anthony pointed out in the 19th century that when American politicians talked about their religious convictions, it was a tremendous coincidence, but religion always agreed with what they believed in the first place. And I think that idea from the late 19th century transports very well to the early 21st, because it's rare to hear, not impossible, not unheard of, but rare to hear Americans who are using religion as a campaign tool to say, you know, I've always believed X, but it's really been a tough crisis of conscience for me because my religion teaches Y, so I really got to go with Y, even though you like X better. Have you ever heard anybody say that? Have you ever heard a politician say to a crowd, I know X is popular, I know X polls great, but Jesus said Y, so I'm going with Y? Never, or virtually never. And here we are, a country at war, and some of the most persuasive passages in the New Testament talked about how you, well, at least difficult things that you have to wrestle with, had to do with what you do with enemies, how you think about people who hate you, how you treat people who want to hurt you. And here in this supposedly most religious of all the Western democracies, I never heard a single leader in the party that Jesus apparently belongs to now talk in any way that indicated that any of that might have given them the slightest bit of pause. In fact, quite often you heard the opposite, a kind of chilling bloodlust. I remember one speech in particular where the president, as almost a joking aside, referred to people who had been caught on the battlefield and then said to his audience, well, they won't be threatening the United States of America anymore, if you know what I mean. And this audience got to its feet and cheered like crazy. Basically, you know, we had found these people and killed them on the battlefield, and hurrah. It might give a Christian at least pause, a second's pause before, you know, do I, like the State of the Union thing, where you're looking to see who else is standing up to see who applauds. I think on the left side of the equation, there is some head-scratching going on because they're trying to figure out how to harness some of those same enthusiasms and put them to work on the left side of the equation. So rather than being ready to go arm's length again, sever some of those ties, go back to a respectful distance, the Michael Lerners and the Jim Wallaces of the world are going to school on the religious right and wondering how they can do it, and by their lights, to better ends and to better effect, but they're still trying to figure out how to make use of those same things. The famous values voter question after 2004, a beautiful case of garbage in, garbage out. If you ask the kind of dumb questions that poll asked, you're likely to get dumb answers, and you did, but again, that was met with a kind of triumphalism and was cited in many speeches right after the 2004 election by the Tom DeLays, by the Karl Roves, by the Gary Bowers as proof that what they were selling was definitely being bought and was working. So I don't think this is over. I don't think that religionized politics is a spent force or anything like it. What we're seeing now, I think, is a more media savvy, more organizational savvy, not in a pejorative sense, but less primitive kind. Because the people who invented this movement, the Vigorys and the Weyrichs and the Robertsons and the Falwells and on, are now aged, ill, dying, and the new guys understand how to, basically for the same fixed cost as it would be to just videotape your own Sunday morning sermon, to get that beamed into households across America, how to use computers to target mailings, how to use church-supplied mailing lists to tremendous effect. This is an army that's still organized, standing in lines, and waiting for its marching orders. Still has tremendous convening power, the religious right. And I don't think you're going to see that go anywhere right away. Because they were never a very large portion of the population overall, I think their power was always exaggerated, but in a largely evenly divided country, you only needed to marshal a solid, reliable 10% of the vote to pull candidates over 50% plus one, just get them across the finish line, and they won. When the Republicans took the Senate back in the two waves that had happened in the 90s, they didn't get any more votes than Democratic senatorial candidates did. Yet they took a comfortable lead in the Senate and took, granted, it was the smallest majority in House history, but they had a majority in the House for the first time in 40 years, and that's with fewer votes than Democratic candidates got in those same elections. Where's the interesting part going on now? When you talk about the environment, when you talk to the Richard Ciziks of the world, when you talk to the Richard Balls of the world, who are finding a more receptive audience among evangelical Christians, when they talk about how despoiling the planet isn't exalted or praised or thought of as a good idea anywhere in Scripture. And I think they get that. And you're seeing interesting coalition building, not only on the environment, but on aid to the developing world. A tremendous amount of not only concern, but action around Darfur, around HIV and AIDS in Africa, around the effect of various economic policies and globalization on the poorest of the poor in the world. And that's actually bringing face-to-face people who didn't often meet up with each other, who have in common that they're Christians and they do believe in what the Gospels say about the poorest among us. So it's kind of a mixed and interesting bag. I think Mike Huckabee toward the end was really running to be the unofficial elected leader of that coalition in the Republican Party, because he kept on when there was no longer any hope of electoral success, but he won another 5 states. And that gives him a lot of that same kind of convening power in the councils of that part of the Republican coalition. But I'll always look at Mike Huckabee's candidacy, which I covered to some extent, got out of Washington and followed him around the country a little bit, as a missed opportunity, because while he was, as E.J. notes, talking about religious economic populism in a way that was new and fresh and kind of interesting, he also purposely ducked opportunities to talk about that nexus of faith and politics. After all, he was a state executive, and before he was a state executive, he was the head of the Southern Baptist Convention in Arkansas. Someone, I mean, there's very few resumes that both of those things appear on. And all his years as a pastor and a successful one, here he was being asked about ways that his worldview derived from Christian teaching shaped his ideas about what government does and how it does it, and he often dunked it on things like capital punishment, where it was easier to make a joke and move on, get out of the uncomfortable moment, especially in front of mixed audiences, and move on. Or as he did in the case of one questioner complained that he was the guy who was getting all the religious questions, which I found kind of odd given his past experience. But thank you for setting the table, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you. I just want to say a couple of quick things in response to Ray. One, I very much appreciate the fact that he underscored the historical role of Christianity in progressive American movements. And you can go back to the anti-slavery movement that got its energy from the rise of evangelicals. At the 1912 Progressive Party convention, Theodore Roosevelt ended his speech by saying, his acceptance speech, by saying, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." Now imagine Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama saying that. Maybe they will this year. But clearly Teddy Roosevelt assumed that the Lord was on the side of progressivism. Another very important case, Father John Ryan, who was head of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. In many ways, he was an author of the New Deal. He was very close to Franklin Roosevelt. Many of the ideas that Ryan put forward at the turn of the century and the bishop's 1919 program for social reconstruction was a deeply New Deal sort of argument. It was an alternative to pure capitalism and state socialism. And lastly, in this election, I think Obama, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have spoken in intriguing ways about religion. I think Obama has really put together a fairly comprehensive look at this, where he seems to be calling us back to a promised land that involved Martin Luther King Jr. and Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr is one of Obama's heroes, and I think that's a very interesting move. On the point about how we all use religion for our own purposes, I love the C.S. Lewis line, I'm paraphrasing here, that most of us don't look to the gospel for guidance on how we should approach political questions. We ransack the gospel for support for our own political party, and that is, I think, a sin committed across the board. Just very briefly to defend the proposition that I put forward that the religious right is on the decline. Obviously, unless you believe in the rapture, these folks aren't going to disappear. What I'm arguing is that, first of all, many of these voters are starting to vote on other issues. I think what you saw in 2006 is, on the one hand, evangelical Christians were the most loyal Republican constituency, and actually the gap between very religious voters and completely non-religious voters grew between 04 and 06. That's because the defection rates from the Republicans were higher among the non-religious than they were among the religious, but there were large defections, substantial defections away from the evangelicals. My own theory on this is that we go through cycles when religious and cultural issues are more or less important in our politics. In 1928, the key issues were whether we should elect the first Catholic president, Al Smith, and whether alcohol should be legal, whether we should continue prohibition. A funny thing happened on the way to 1932. It was October 29, 1929, the Great Crash, the Great Depression. Suddenly, whether you could buy a drink or not, although you might have needed it more, didn't matter so much in the middle of the Great Depression. And we began this very long, relatively secular period that I think runs from 32 to 1980. I think we're at the end of that period now because the issues have become so large in the non-religious and non-cultural sphere, the economic mess, Iraq, our foreign policy standing generally. And on some of the evidence that Ray cited, I just note that you really have some real conversions going on. Again, not that evangelical Christians of yesterday are becoming ADA liberals of tomorrow or joining MoveOn.org, but that they are broadening their agenda. Rich Cizik is a great example where he, again, stood up to an awful lot of pressure to his right in saying evangelicals have an obligation to creation care, should care about global warming. There was a showdown in the board of the National Association of Evangelicals, and Rich Cizik's side won 37-1. This is not,
the environmental concern of evangelicals is not just some grass tops movement. It's also a grassroots movement. And then there is just a certain alienation from the misuse of religion, or as many evangelicals are coming to see it. My friend David Quo, who worked in President Bush's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, wrote a very interesting book where he expressed his own disillusionment with, and he remained personally very loyal to President Bush, but was critical of everything else, including the policy. And I always loved David's line where he said, Jesus is not some get-out-the-vote guy. And I think what's happening, the reason I think there is a transformation going on, is that a lot of evangelical conservatives are saying there's something wrong with the idea of Jesus as some get-out-the-vote guy.
Well, maybe those same voters are also, in this particular election year, people who also have perilous, upshifting mortgages,
Yes.
People who live in states where the governor is balancing the budget by jacking up the tuition at the state university at twice the rate of inflation, people who haven't gotten a raise in 7 years. So they are still they're still faithful attenders, what the public opinion researchers love to find, these more than once a week attenders who are 15% of the population. But there are these other things too. But is the Obama and Clinton gambit meant as strictly mechanical politics to talk to those people? Are they considered gettable this year, and that's why we see Obama and Clinton doing what they're doing?
On this point about evangelicals responding to economic pressures, in my religion and politics class this week, I had two very good pollsters who think a lot about this, a Democrat, Anna Greenberg, and a Republican, David Winston. And David was talking about the primacy of economic issues this year, and he sort of said in frustration, evangelicals react like people too, and that they react to the same pressures. And I'm paraphrasing, and my students who are, if they're still here, can correct me, but it was something along those lines, so I couldn't agree more with that. I think when we're talking about will votes shift, if we want to just talk at that level, first of all, it's very important whenever we say evangelical, we act as if all evangelicals are Republican and conservative. If you say that, you've never been inside an African-American church, because, of course, African-Americans are evangelical, and they are overwhelmingly Democratic. They have voted on civil rights issues and economic justice issues for a long time. A lot of Latinos now are evangelical, and while evangelical Latinos were more attracted to President Bush, they have sort of started shifting back the other way, partly on the immigration issue. So we are talking about white evangelical Christians in this context. Those voters, I think, are going to remain Republican for a long time for reasons having nothing to do with the evangelical part. There are many other aspects of them that make them Republican. Many of them are Southerners. The shift among some of those voters started long before the religious right even appeared, back in 1964 in the Goldwater Johnson election. They tend to be middle class. They tend to be in families. People who are married tend to be more Republican than people who are single. So there are a lot of reasons why this group will remain, broadly speaking, more Republican than Democratic. I think the question is whether you're going to see these overwhelming Republican margins that you saw in 2004. My belief is that over time, those margins will shrink, and that there will be a more sizable Democratic minority share of this community. And I think that may be especially true among younger evangelicals. There's some evidence that Obama in particular is doing better among the younger evangelicals than you would expect a Democrat to do. So that if you're looking at political change among evangelicals, that's where I'd see it. In Catholics, I am a Catholic, we are your classic 40-40-20 group, 40% fairly reliably Republican, 40% Democratic, and then 20% who move around. I argue in the book that there is no Catholic vote, and it's important, by which I mean that because there is a big swing constituency among Catholics, they are important. You saw some swing toward Bush in 2004. Catholics started swinging back toward the Democrats in 2006. Again, that was true especially true of Latino Catholics, but it was also true of white Catholics.
That's, I think, one of that's different about the church's wade into the 2004 election. You may recall a certain number, small number admittedly, but a certain number of Catholic bishops very publicly and very loudly said that they would deny John Kerry the sacraments. And that ended up with reporters following him to church every Sunday.
Communion watch.
Or wafer watch, as one called it.
Wafer watch, that's right. Many reporters went to church who might not have gone before. That was the hidden agenda.
The only upside, I think, to the whole thing. Well, do you think it's going to be a similar thing this time, or was that a chastening experience?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. I have a chapter in the book that some of you might identify with. The subtitle is "The Agony of Liberal Catholicism," and I think that agony was felt particularly during the 2004 election, where you had a minority of bishops who happened to be very vocal, setting a tone for the entire church. That was partly because of media coverage, but it wasn't just because of media coverage. I think that what you saw were the certain conservative bishops, particularly Archbishop Chaput, who got a lot of attention in the New York Times, although he later said his full message wasn't given. He put it all, it's still available on his website, his entire interview. A smart thing for a public figure to do, always tape your interviews with reporters and have your own copy. I don't believe that he was badly misrepresented, actually, in the Times account, but and that those voices became the most prominent voices. Now, it's worth remembering that in the communion controversy, our Cardinal McCarrick, then our Archbishop, intervened in a way that diffused it and pushed away the idea that John Kerry should be denied communion. They sort of created it as a local option for bishops. But I think this new document that the bishops have put out on faithful citizenship is very interesting because it's a complicated document reflecting how sensitive these problems are. It does sort of admit to the possibility of a Catholic voting for a pro-choice candidate, provided that the Catholic is not voting for the candidate because he or she is pro-choice. That almost sounds Jesuitical, but it actually opens up, some room. And I think we're all curious as to what Pope Benedict is going to say when he comes here. In the book, I have a line saying that Pope Benedict's wonderful first encyclical on love, in writing it, he played a trick on Catholics like me, who might have expected him to be a more, conservative in his statements. And right, no, not anti-love, but his choice. And then his second encyclical, which I commend everybody, is on hope. Barack Obama could quote some of that encyclical. It's actually quite a beautiful encyclical. So I think, in some ways, so far, Benedict may have disappointed some of his most conservative supporters and surprised some liberals who were, rather fearful. And as soon as I say that, I think, what will those words sound like in about a month after he's been here? We'll find out what he's going to say. I actually have a long chapter in the book on Benedict and John Paul. I had the pleasure of covering the Vatican for the New York Times, and I'll just tell one story on that, if I may. I always was in good standing with the late Abe Rosenthal, then the executive editor, because I helped arrange a private audience with Pope John Paul for Abe. And so so it ended up being an audience with the Pope, Abe, and me. And sounds like a bad memoir. And on the way to the Vatican, we are walking across St. Peter's Square, and I looked at Abe and I said, Abe, I always tell my sources in the Vatican that we have a lot in common because we work for the only two institutions left on earth that claim infallibility. And the very important part of the story is that Abe didn't laugh.
We would love to have your questions. There is a microphone in the center aisle, and if you could tell us who you are and make your question in the form of a question. It's always much appreciated by people who are trying to answer them. And you know, signal with a little lift to your voice at the end and all that it is in fact a question.
My name is Alice Lucan, and I live nearby. I also attend Georgetown Presbyterian Church. We are reading a new book by Jim Lehrer by the name of The Great Awakening. And one of the things he says is that we are now engaged in a religious revival, and he harkens back to other revivals in this country. Do you think that is what is happening now? Both of you.
Well, I like Jim's argument. I've been a friend of Jim's for a long time, and I appreciate what he's doing. And one of the things I like in his argument about the revival is he makes note of that moment in testimony, the altar call at the end of many evangelical services, that the origins of the altar call were in the abolitionist movement. And that when people came up to the altar to commit, they were committing to the abolitionist movement. And somewhere along the way, we lost that part of it. And, you know, I think there is a kind of revival of the sort Jim is describing. You know, if you take all the examples we have cited on the Christian, on the evangelical side, but it also applies to a lot of people in the mainline movement. The other great swing group in our politics, by the way, are mainline Protestants. Catholics are less democratic than they used to be. Mainline Protestants are less Republican than they used to be. So I think something important is going on. But I think for that revival fully to take place, Jim's 60-city tour is going to have to work. I mean, I think Jim is preaching a revival, and I find that a happy event. And I think Jim has, over the years, Jim is very political, but he's also tried to, not to do it in as kind of a narrowly partisan way. He tried real hard, as did I, to support President Bush's faith-based initiative, for example. At the beginning, it was one of the handful of things what did I like about President Bush? He married a teacher and a librarian. My late mom is a teacher and a librarian. But I had some sympathy for the faith-based initiative until it turned out that there wasn't any funding, really, more funding going to the poor, and there were parts of it that were risking running roughshod over certain First Amendment limits that we should respect. But John DeGioia, who ran that for 6 months and then left, is a very dear friend. But then, Jim and I and many people like us sort of said, this isn't really working. This isn't really about helping the poor. So I think Jim is very serious about preaching a revival, and I hope he succeeds.
I think if you look at the numbers, it won't be a revival in the 19th century sense of the term, where unchurched populations are dragged into the corral of an active faith. It's more likely going to be that when you look at the mix of the 306 or so million people who live in this country, the fraction that is highly congregationally involved and very devoted to religious life will be a larger fraction. But when you look strictly at religious numbers, denominational numbers, they won't look that different.
And
it's a subtle kind of thing.
No, I think that's a good point. In this recent Pew Forum study, Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, the fastest growing group is secular Americans. That is to say, atheist agnostics or people without religion. It's gone from about 7% at birth, now 16% of the same people think of themselves as disconnected from religion. So another reason for this commotion, I believe, and my friend John Green, who's done a lot of work on this, also argues this, actually we argued it together recently, is that you've had a rise of evangelical Christianity and a rise of secularism. This creates real opportunities for friction at the two ends, if you will, of this religious spectrum. And I think some of the friction comes from the growth of both groups. There's a big religious middle, however you define that, but that a lot of the tension is between these two forces.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Dionne and Mr. Suarez, for coming out today. My name is Colin Roger. I'm a freshman in the college. You've both spoken about the fact that the evangelical right seems to be a waning movement, but not a gone movement. And so I attended a CPAC this past year, where I watched the essential, at the time, tobacco nominee be booed, and watched the very next day the president be cheered to
You want to take that first?
Well, it's not only Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh who are not happy that John McCain is going to be the Republican nominee. Leaders of evangelical conservative organizations are not very happy either, and a lot of them have not come on side yet and are still saying that they're unhappy, even though the inevitable seems to be on its way. So what you get out of that is not members of that movement voting for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, but the kind of thing instead that gives Ken Melman and Karl Rove nightmares, which is those people staying home, because it's when you get them out that you win. And when they're feeling alienated or taken for granted or not being heard is when they stay home, and that's when you lose.
Just on CPAC in particular, this is a particular activist ideological sliver of the entire conservative movement, and I don't say that with disrespect. There's the same thing exists on the left side of the spectrum as well. I think one of the lessons of the Republican primaries is that we've always focused on Republicans who are very conservative, but there's, on the polls, they're typically asked you very conservative, somewhat conservative, and the same on liberal or moderate. There are a lot of somewhat conservatives out there, and they are the ones, along with the handful who really didn't like President Bush, who gave McCain the nomination. In the end, I'd be very surprised if very many of these leaders stayed out of it. And I think mostly McCain will rally them against either Obama or Clinton. It's a question, as Ray said, partly about turnout, partly how many defections will there be among those voters who may vote on other questions and find it easier to do so because McCain is not one of them. I mean, it's fascinating that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama seem more at ease in talking about religion than John McCain is. And I don't disrespect him for that. In fact, if he doesn't want to do it, I hope he holds the line, because I don't like politicians faking it. You know, that old Hollywood line, what you need is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you can do anything. And that's really dangerous with religion. And I think he may well be a person of faith who doesn't like to talk about it, but I think that just creates an interesting fact here. But honestly, I'll be very surprised if ideological conservatives don't end up with John McCain, especially because the abortion issue is very important to these voters, and he is, broadly speaking, pro-life. And for voters for whom abortion is the most important issue, he is actually, you know, from their point of view, substantially better than Clinton or Obama. So I'm skeptical of how much these leaders will hold back to the end. I don't think Ann Coulter delivers very many votes. Rush is pretty important. You know, has some real influence. I bet you by the time Election Day rolls around, he'll find plenty of things not to like about either Democrat if they're nominated.
If you check the Hill handbook that comes out every 2 years with the new Congress, you'll find in every edition, because John McCain's been on the Hill for an awful long time, that he's identified as an Episcopalian, but let it drop that he's really a Baptist when he was campaigning in South Carolina. So he's not totally immune to this kind of thing. I guess this was just seized by the desire for straight talk. The desire for straight talk let it drop that he had been attending a Baptist megachurch.
Maybe he was born again when he crossed
Phoenix.
the state line.
Yeah, maybe so. Yes, go.
Oh, it's great to see you.
Koreans who do not see the role of the government as being one that should advance their personal religious beliefs. So I guess if you could expand on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I guess two questions. On the Tom Frank thing, on the one hand, I think Tom Frank first of all, he's a brilliant guy and a great writer, and I think he identifies something important, which is that these votes for social issue conservatism have often been used primarily for economic issue conservatism. It's why I couldn't resist throwing the capital gains tax cut at Ralph Reed when I had that conversation with him all those years ago. So I think there's truth there. But I am uncomfortable with false consciousness sorts of arguments. And there's a brilliant young writer called Garance Franke Ruta, there's a name to conjure, who wrote a brilliant piece a few years back in the American Prospect, basically making the argument that an awful lot of lower income voters are also in situations where they're having more trouble holding their families together, raising their kids. The rate of single parenthood is much higher among lower income people than among higher income people, and that the concern about traditional values is for them a very real practical concern, as well as a concern related to their religious values, that you can't make as sharp a distinction between cultural issues and economic issues as liberals like me might be tempted to make. And that the other thing on that is that when people make this sort of argument, gee, these people are voting against their economic interests, I live in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm grateful that all the upper middle class people in Bethesda, Maryland vote against their narrow economic interests, all these liberals, because you wouldn't have any upper middle class liberals if people didn't care about things other than their economic interests narrowly conceived. And so that's why I think that it is important to make an economic case to these voters. It is important for progressives to say, what are you really getting out of this vote on the cultural side? But also, I think, to understand where these voters are coming from culturally. And I think that's why this, an honest as opposed to dishonest rediscovery of religion is very important to the progressive side of politics. On Latin America, I'd like Ray to talk about that more, but the Latino vote is a fascinating vote, and it is in flux. I mean, it's very striking that in 2004 there was a debate about what the exit polls, whether they were right or wrong. It's pretty clear that Bush got up to about 40% of the Latino vote. There are some estimates that it was higher, but it's probably around 40%. That's a very big percentage for the Republicans. The Republicans can do just fine if they manage 40% of the Latino vote. The very interesting split is that evangelical Latinos were far more likely to vote Republican. They voted substantially for Bush. Catholic Latinos were much less likely to vote for Bush. And that vote changed sharply in 2006. So that I think the contest for the Latino vote is going to be very important in our politics. I honestly don't know how much of the sort of base community kind of Christianity any of them carry with them from their countries in Latin America. I think there's one reason why the Republicans are lucky that they nominated McCain. In fact, Anna Greenberg, who came to my class this week, a different approach to faith-based politics, she said, I prayed and prayed and prayed that the Republicans would nominate Rudy Giuliani or Mitt Romney or Fred Thompson, but her prayers were not answered. And McCain, I think, is far better placed because of his stand on immigration to at least pick up Latino votes, cut potential Republican losses compared to almost any other Republican.
Well, as a Daily Deadline journalist, I really don't like to indulge in crystal ball gazing, but I think even John McCain's somewhat more accommodationist stance on immigration isn't going to cut much ice. The Republicans have really shot themselves in the head on this one.
Not even the foot.
No, not even the foot. They've shot themselves in the head, alienating what is the largest and fastest growing minority group in the United States, not by talking in a serious way about illegal immigration, but by collapsing all the boundaries of the immigration debate writ large into each other so that what starts out as a conversation about illegal immigration ends up being a rant about immigration, period, which at a time of growing economic insecurity becomes poisonous not only to those people who are in the country illegally, but also becomes pretty painful for those people who aren't here illegally and pay taxes and are raising their kids and get some of the nasty snap from that debate too. And the old rule of thumb was, when you finally naturalized, you would, first party you joined would be the party that was in power in the White House when you naturalized. 2 out of 3 new naturalizations are becoming Democrats. They're trashing the rule of thumb and throwing the pieces away because this is such a peculiar time when it comes to that. We should also remember that in addition to being Democrats, Latino Catholics and Black Protestants are also social conservatives, even though they vote for Democrats. And during the sunny days before the invasion of Baghdad, Republican theorists trying to look down the road at the America coming in the 2020s and the 2030s had high hopes for peeling off portions of the black vote and the Latino vote permanently by stressing social conservatism. This has been junked too, this enterprise, because no matter who gets the Democratic nomination in Denver this summer, the black vote is not going to go to John McCain, and neither is the Latino vote. Also, much less talked about, becoming a Protestant is aspirational. Latinos, we tend to romanticize their relationship to the church back in their home countries. The church is often aligned with the most retrograde elements in society that had their hobnailed boots on their poor, scrawny necks for hundreds of generations. And then when they get here, one of the ways you become an American is by becoming a Protestant. That's the church that has all the juice, actually has a pastor who can speak Spanish, and the same one shows up every week because you're not so vocation short that you're trying to muster up a team to go stand by the altar every Sunday. Yes, a very important part of the growth of Roman Catholicism in the last 30 years has come from Latino immigration, but there are now Latino megachurches in the Sun Belt where people are speaking in tongues, raising their hands, praise shouts and the whole deal, a much more freewheeling and much more satisfying form of worship for a lot of them, and also one that makes them feel like they're assimilating into a greater American whole.
There are going to be demands that they speak in tongues in English soon if this immigration debate goes the way it is. Sir.
We have time for one really quick question.
Or can we just take 2 quick ones and then we'll answer them both? So because this lady has stood in line back there.
Okay, I certainly have one really good one. My name is Bergsman. I'm a libertarian who moved from Chevy Chase, where, as far as I could tell, most of my neighbors were moderate Republicans, to southern Maryland, Calvert County, where every single one of my neighbors is an evangelical Christian. So I'm used to being an outsider. One of the earlier questions prompted me to come up here and ask you gentlemen, and thank you very much for a really stimulating discussion, I really appreciate it, to ask you your views on the future of the influence, of the political influence of clergymen in the United States. What kind of hypothesis that I carry away from this discussion is that, yes, the religious right is on the wane, but maybe the moral majority, not necessarily the right, is still with us and gaining with a broader agenda than it used to have, that if you're somewhere in the middle of American politics, maybe this is a good thing. But in any case, wouldn't this weaken the political influence of the guy in the pulpit or the lady in the pulpit trying to influence how his or her congregation votes, because the religion, as you've been saying, and I think you're right, the religion is sort of getting separated from the politics. So are we going to see in the next, whatever, 10, 15 years, a reduction in the political influence of the clergy?
And could we take the next one? We'll answer that, and then please. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Susan Howard. I just wanted to get your reflections on one of the more interesting parts of the 2000 election and religion in my mind, and that was Mitt Romney's candidacy as the first Mormon candidate. And in some ways, it felt like he was almost put to a religious test for office in that case. I have acquaintances who go to one of the big mega churches, and their minister basically told them that he would sooner rather vote for Hillary Clinton than Mitt Romney. And that was largely based on a lot of sort of false notions of Mormonism as a faith and sort of myths and legends of what goes on under the robe, so to speak. So I wonder if you could just address that briefly.
Do you want to go in there?
Well, I'll take the Mitt Romney question, if it's okay. The interesting thing about Mitt Romney is that he consistently refused to engage on what Mormons do believe. And in the absence of good information, bad information finds it very easy to breed. I understand entirely why, as a matter of being a candidate for public office, he didn't want to go on a roving tour of the United States explaining Mormon Christology and Mormon theology. But at the same time, that refusal, I think, didn't do him very much good in the final analysis, because the bad stuff was able to stay out there, but people who were willing to listen didn't get to hear it from his mouth. The much vaunted speech that he made that was supposed to hearken back to the Houston Ministerial Association speech of 1960 was in some ways diametrically opposed to the Houston Ministerial Association speech in its novel assertions about American life and the relation of religion and American life. It's kind of an insult to Lech Wałęsa and Archbishop Luum and Joan of Arc to say that religion needs freedom and freedom needs religion. Ask anybody who's been sustained by their religion in the worst regimes in the world whether religion can only exist in a state of freedom, and I don't think they'll tell you yes. He also put the influence of his church at arm's length and then wouldn't talk about what it is that he was putting at arm's length. So I think it was a problem for him. I don't think it was as much of a problem as people make it out to be. A lot of people just found him a very unappealing candidate. And he had other handicaps that were totally removed from the fact that he was a member of an American minority religion. Running as with one of your main resume items being that you were governor of Massachusetts and then disavowing many of the things you did there is it's a novel way of trying to build a national coalition. And many of the things you said there and many of the things you did there, which in the age of YouTube trail you like toilet paper stuck to your heel when you come out of the men's room. You can't shake it. So.
Just real quick on both. The clergy is very complicated, I think, because I know within the Catholic Church there is great concern on the part of the clergy, and I'm talking about the good clergy, that the scandal within the church has created, let's put it charitably, a much greater difficulty in communicating on some of these issues, and I think it may have created a certain reluctance on public issues on the part of some priests and leaders of the church, though not others. But it's worth thinking back in the Catholic case to those really powerful letters that liberals, left, and conservatives did that the American bishops put out in the mid-'80s. I write about these some in the book, on War and Peace and on economic life. These were very prophetic documents that really stirred a big debate both within the church and outside. And then more generally, I think the clergy's influence on politics is always mixed, and it's sort of more effective in some churches than others. I think there is a tradition in the African American church to pay attention to what the clergy says, though not always follow it. There's a tradition in some conservative evangelical churches to do that. But there's also a lot of rebellion against the clergy when they engage too clearly in political matters. I know my late mom, who was a very serious Catholic, would almost always on principle vote against any candidate who was being pushed too hard inside the church, and I don't think she was alone in that. So I think, the clergy's role, I think, is most powerful not when it pushes a party or a candidate, but when it calls people to account on a moral question. On Romney, and I want to close on that in a second, on Romney, I do think there was anti-Mormon prejudice going on, and I was unhappy that the exit polls didn't ask in at least one state where you might have seen it, where there was a substantial evangelical vote, and it wasn't just evangelicals who had this prejudice, if Romney's religion had anything to do with their vote. I think it hurt him. I agree with Ray. He had other problems as a candidate. And that speech, the most disturbing part of that speech, the first half of that speech I liked, because it said there should be no religious test. And I think anybody who's part of any minority in the country should stand up for people in other minorities. And so I actually wrote a column. I have no particular sympathy for Mitt Romney's politics, but I wrote a kind of pro-Mormon column saying, especially if you're, say, a Catholic or a Jew, you don't want to see discrimination against these folks. And a friend of mine who was meeting with some Mormon leaders later said they want to make you an elder of the church, which I'm not sure they'd actually want me, but I was glad about that because I didn't like the prejudice. On the other hand, in the second part of that speech, when Romney said, I'm not going to talk about my religious beliefs except to say I believe in Jesus, I thought that was a very, you talk about smacking of opportunism, is I will tell you the one thing about my faith that might get me some votes in South Carolina and Alabama. And I thought there were parts of that speech that were very good and parts that were mistaken. But yeah, I think there is, and the polling suggests a strong feeling about Mormons. Lastly, there is, there's a real competition going on between evangelical Christians and Mormons for souls. These are both very evangelical faiths. They do convert people. And I think some of the hostility comes out of the intense competition. Just to go back, I'll close on this just to prove that I actually am a Catholic. I actually think that the church's job, a church writ large, not just the Catholic Church, is to make everybody feel guilty about something. And I think religion is doing its job in politics when it makes everybody feel guilty about something. What I mean by that is that in conventional terms, if you're a liberal, I do think it's important that you think about the life issues and assisted suicide and what kind of rules should we have around the new medical technologies. And you shouldn't just write off those questions as easy, which I don't. If you're a conservative, you really should worry about where your ideology leads you when it comes to caring for the poor and the least among us. And if our religious voices make us all feel a little guilty about something, I think then they are doing their job in politics. Thank you very much.
Just a quick announcement. EJ and Ray will be up front signing books, and I can honestly say I've been in this room now many times for 4 years with many distinguished speakers, and usually within an hour the room has cleared out by half of the people. It is a sign of how fantastic of an event this was that almost everyone is still here 15 minutes past the appointed end time. So please join me in thanking EJ and Ray one more time. Thank you.